you everybody for joining us. And this is an important topic for a lot of us in the hobby as we um, continue to grow old. Quite honestly, I was at the summer seminar for the APS.
Do you want to maintain your big screen?
Oh, yep. I was at the seminar the last time they had it in person, and Scott was giving an update on the APS membership and the average age of the APS membership. And one of the statistics that struck me as interesting, I may not get it exactly right, but that there were more members over the age of 80 than there were under the age of 50 in the society. And it is what it is. There are a lot of us that are activists to bring new people into the hobby. I think as tragic as the pandemic has been, it's probably been good for our hobby. But as we look to the future, it's certainly important that we all think about where's our collection going to go, right? What do we want to do with it? What's the legacy that we want to leave behind? What's the right thing to do for yourself? What's the right thing to do for your family? What's the right thing to do for the hobby? And I put a qualifier or a caveat right here on the front page that I want to make sure that everybody understands, right? I am not an estate planner. I am not an attorney. I'm not a certified appraiser. I am just a stamp collector like everyone else here that has put a little time and energy into this topic to try to think through it and have received a lot of good advice from others as I've talked about it in the past. So with any aspect of financial planning or estate planning, it's always going to be a good idea for you to seek professional guidance and make sure that your legal documents are appropriately defined, that your insurance is in order, all of those aspects. So this is not meant to be legal or financial advice today. It's much more operational or organizational advice, and happy to answer questions to the extent that I can, or we can as a group have a discussion. But just understand I am not an attorney by any stretch of the imagination. I install robots into warehouses and distribution centers. So this is really meant to be something that could be used as a guide, right? Step by step, what you should be doing, what you should be thinking about as you consider your estate planning process as it relates to your stamp collection, right? What can you do to make this easy for those that you leave behind? That's really probably the most important consideration here. But of course, what do you want to have happen with the stuff that you've worked for so many years to put together as your collection? And what's the right way to support our hobby? There's a lot that you can give back to the hobby by passing material on to other people that are going to attach value to it just like you have. So thinking through how to make this happen and doing it while you're fully have the capacity to do so is, can't be understated how important that is, right? So we're going to talk about how you should describe the collection, how you should value the stamp collection, what you should think about in terms of providing direction and guidance so that your heirs can do the right thing and accord your wishes and do the right thing for themselves. So where do you start? Planning ahead, right? This is kind of, stating the obvious here, right? It's much more likely that you're going to get the outcome you want if you define the direction and set those expectations now, right? Advanced planning. Not only will you get the right outcome in terms of the collection itself, but you may have the opportunity to minimize estate taxes, thinking about how you want to pass the material on. It can be, it's going to better ensure that your collection is going to be dispersed in the way that you want to have it dispersed. It can also maximize the value to your heirs if they're ultimately going to be selling the collection and putting it back into the philatelic market. And in order to do that, right, detailed instructions. Take the time to actually sit down and write it down. Obviously in this day and age, that means sitting down at your computer and writing it down. But if that's, someone that that's in our hobby that needs help with this and that's not something they're comfortable with, you either need to engage someone to help them create those documents, or certainly, a handwritten but well-documented inventory, et cetera, is going to be really, really important. A lot of us have our collections insured. They're not, as I'm sure most of you know, the collection is not covered on your homeowner's insurance, so we carry specialized philatelic insurance. If you have a policy, make sure that the policy number, the provider of the policy, all of that information is readily available, so that if they dispose of the collection, they can cancel the policy, or if they're maintaining the collection, they can assume the policy, et cetera. So just as part of the information, think about your insurance information. It's probably not a whole lot different than maybe your key contact information of people you know in the hobby that you've worked with to acquire material, specialized dealers that are going to understand what you have, et cetera. So, there should be an inventory of key philatelic contacts and information as one of the things that you put together. An inventory of what you have, right? And this can be as simple as the black binders have, West Indies postal history in it. The blue ones are U.S. material. Create an inventory of what you have with some sense of the evaluation of that material. And make sure it's an honest evaluation. We'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but it doesn't mean full catalog value. It doesn't mean some sort of idealized retail selling price or something. It's probably an honest assessment of what could be expected if the collection were sold to a dealer who's going to resell it. And what is your plan, right? How do you want to distribute the material? It may well be, it's certainly in my case, there's all this stuff goes here. This other stuff should go there. This pile should be donated. This pile should be sold with this specific dealer because they specialize. So a plan for distribution isn't as simple as, call the Mystic Stamp Company and they'll buy it, right? I mean, it may be, depending on your accumulation, that may actually be a great piece of advice, but think specifically about what you have, what it is that you'd like to be maintained as a collection versus disposed of in one way or another. And then select someone who can administer that process for you. We'll talk about it in a minute, but the person who administers your philatelic estate can be completely different than the person who's administering the rest of your estate. There's no issue with having multiple administrators. Make sure that the people who are going to come into possession of your collection understand how it needs to be cared for. And part of that effort, of course, should be organizing it while you can so that it's not just piles of stuff, right? I mean, we all have piles of stuff as well as nicely organized binders or albums or other methods of maintaining stuff that we have processed to the extent that we want to process it. But we also undoubtedly have boxes of treasure that is in that I'm going to get to it someday pile or status that we may not have gotten to. You want to create mobility for your collection. In other words, all those huge piles that might be on the floor, you're going to be better off to put them into document storage boxes. Make your collection easy to handle and easy to move without damage. Because assume that the people that are going to be moving it or perhaps shipping it somewhere or in some other way dealing with it probably have no idea what they're doing, right? So make it easy for them to handle it, store it, and move it without damage. So that's why the comment about humidity control is here. In my conversations with Scott at APS, the horror stories, and we'll talk about more of them in a minute, but the number of times that they've been called about collections that have been stored in the garage or the basement since Grandpa passed away that are now completely ruined versus potentially quite valuable is limitless. So make sure people understand not only how to handle it, but where to store it as they're waiting for that final disposition. And if you need to, if you've got particular high valued items, it doesn't hurt to actually show them now how to handle the material, what the various tools are for. things like tongs, et cetera, if there are particular items that dealers are going to be interested in looking at, make sure that they, as your heirs, understand what they need to know in order to handle the collection. Here's the comment I made previously about the insurance company contact information and how important that is as well. When it comes to the inventory, the more organized and complete your inventory information is, probably the better outcome you're going to achieve financially. Right? It's not critical that the inventory be exactly accurate. It's not critical that it be a formal appraisal. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but make it easy for the inventory to be inspected. Make it easy to collate the inventory document to the collection itself, especially for the better items. Right? If you've got that one binder that has the really rare postal history in it or the really rare stamps of your area of specialization, make sure that that binder is uniquely identified and called out as opposed to the balance of the collection that may represent less value. So different items of different value warrant different treatment, right? And like I said here, the inventory doesn't have to be that complete list. I mean, I could live to be 150 and never create a complete list of what I own, right? Nor would I ever want to, right? But if there are different elements of the collection, or you've got an exhibit that you keep in a safety deposit box or something, or anything that's stored away from the home, you want to make sure that that's called out. And if you can simply identify, this collection, it's these albums, there's this many albums, here's the title of the contents. If you've got a library, and there's a fair amount of value in a philatelic library. One of the gentlemen on our call earlier was talking about the fact that he had 2,000 titles on his database of pieces of philatelic literature. There's real value associated with some of those materials in addition to the stamps themselves, and making sure that that's called out, identified. And then if you have material, of extraordinary value and uniqueness that even warrants the expertization and certificates, make sure all the certificates are together, that it calls out what that material is, where the material resides in the collection to tie the certificate back to the material, and just be as descriptive as you can. You saw my example down here at the bottom, right? The blue binder in the bookcase, in the stamp room, the envelope in the bank vault, whatever, so that when they have the inventory and they're looking into your stamp room and being overwhelmed by all of the books and binders and piles and stuff that they're looking at, that they can figure out how to create the correlation between the inventory and the material itself. This is the honest evaluation. So this is all about setting expectations for the heirs that are going to be dealing with your collection. And there's, again, my APS friends telling me stories of people that had built really nice collections. The heirs didn't understand it, didn't appreciate that there was value, and it wound up in a dumpster rather than in some other stamp collector's hands. Or, of course, even more common is we've pontificated about the immense value of our collection to our family members, only to have them find out that, in fact, the immense value just isn't there, right? And there's all sorts of disappointment related to years of believing that this was an asset that had accumulated massive value that was going to fund granddaughter's college education or something, when in fact it turns out to have dramatically less value. So even if you don't want to discuss the specific value of your collection with your heirs prior to your passing, it's a good idea to make a reasonable estimate of the real value of the collection and just leave it with the other information to not be opened until after you're gone. And that way you don't have to confront any challenges associated with perhaps misalignment around perceived value. If you know it, it's always a good idea to include catalog value, or this is what I paid for it, or this is the insured value for replacement, and this is what I think you could probably get for it if you were going to sell it in the market. You don't need a formal appraisal. And in fact, I've found actually that the formal appraisal can be part of the problem, depending on who it is that's done the appraisal, what their frame of reference is. We all are subjective, right, in terms of where we attach value to items in our collection. And of course, ultimately, the value is driven by the market. But I witnessed a presentation, for example, I witnessed a presentation from a gentleman who was a certified appraiser. He was a professional appraiser, and he was talking about what the steps were associated with getting a stamp collection appraised, and was telling stories of some of the collections he had appraised, including one that he had been to recently where the collector had collected several years worth of new issues from several countries, had many binders filled with new issues from the last 20 or 30 years, which he dismissed of having little or no value to the family for whom he was performing the appraisal. And to a classic collector who only, focuses on material from the first 100 years of stamp, perhaps that's a true statement, right? There are a lot of collectors who aren't interested in modern material. But the reality is there are topical collectors or even worldwide collectors that in fact would attach value to material from the last 30 years. So it's good to keep an open mind. And I suspect if you're going to go through an appraisal process, it's really no different than if you were going to go through some sort of medical evaluation where it's not a bad idea to get multiple opinions or seek out a specialist. Don't be afraid to have multiple dealers or multiple appraisers, even if you want to, look at a collection and give you their estimate of what they think the value of that material is. And I will guarantee you that no two people will give you the same number. So, but be realistic in your documentation of value for use by your heirs or your administrator. And then give them some guidance. What's the plan? What do you want to do? Right? Do I want to pass my collection on? Is there someone in the family that's expressed interest? I realize that's probably a rarity, but in some cases there is someone that you know in the family or others that you know in the hobby that you just want to pass the collection to them because you know they're going to attach either sentimental, financial, or philatelic value to that collection because of you and the work that you've put into it. Are there portions of the collection that you want to have used to support the hobby, in particular some of the youth programs? The several groups that I'm involved with have active programs to support kids. The Southeastern Federation of Stamp Clubs that I belong to has a big youth program. The APS, of course, has their Stamps Teach program. The International Society of Worldwide Stamp Collectors has a program to give away stamps. The Boy Scouts, where I teach the merit badge, has a 501c for donating material to the Scouts. So there are all sorts of charitable outlets for material, especially for less valuable, colorful material that's going to be appreciated by younger collectors. It's a great way to reinvigorate the hobby. And quite honestly, given there's not a lot of financial value in those super common global definitives and commemoratives, you might as well give them away, right? And directly recontribute to the hobby. If you've promised any items in particular to someone else, make sure you write it down and document that promise. Like this collection, this binder, this stamp needs to go to Sally because Sally's worked with me for a long time. I know she collects the same thing I do, and I really want her to have this because she will appreciate it more than anyone else. Write that down so that it's not your family members being confronted by Sally going, hey, remember Bob said he would give me this stamp, and the family members, of course, having no idea what Sally's even talking about, right? Do you want to sell the collection? And if you want to sell the collection, should you sell some of it now while you're still here? And the answer more than likely is probably some combination of all of the above, right? It may well be that if you've got a very good specialist collection of some particular aspect of the hobby, and none of us plan our own demise, but you feel like the right thing to do for your heirs is to actually convert that collection to cash and then leave them the money rather than the duty of having to dispose of that collection. It's a choice to make. And some of the interesting philatelists that I've worked with that are very serious in some of the areas of the West Indies, it's kind of interesting to watch that They build a collection, they exhibit the collection, they declare completeness, they sell the collection, take the money and buy something else. It's like a kind of recycling program of their capital investment in stamps, as opposed to someone like me that just keeps accumulating and accumulating and accumulating. So if you want to sell part of it, it's a good idea to identify specific dealers that you think would be most likely to sell that portion of your collection directly to the end consumer, because they're going to be more willing to pay you more, or the heirs more, for that collection than a dealer who's going to buy it and turn around and flip it as a collection to somebody else, right? So it's just all about margin. You know, we run a social media page for the International Society of Worldwide Stamp Collectors, and I get asked all the time of, I just inherited grandma, grandpa's, Uncle Bob's, whatever's stamp collection. What do I do with it? And invariably what I tell them to do is go to the APS website, to the dealer directory, find a dealer member that lives in their geographic proximity, and then go ask that individual's advice, given that they can look at the collection, and knowing that they're an APS member dealer, that you can trust the advice that they'll give you. But the closest dealer, of course, isn't always the best answer. You know, for example, in my world of Cayman Island stuff, if I were looking to maximize the financial value of my postal history collection for the Cayman Islands, I would call Phoebe at the Victoria Stamp Company in New Jersey to run it through her auction, because that's what she specializes in. If I called my local stamp dealer in Georgia, the price that they would offer me would be dramatically less, because they're going to turn around and have Phoebe sell it anyway, or someone else, right? You know, so think about, what's the connection? Where did you accumulate the material? What's the connection back into the market? And provide the instructions. If you're not going to dispose of it, provide the directions that says, you know, this box goes here, this box goes there. You know, or if that feels like too much work, help them figure out what's the best way to dispose of it in total, recognizing that it may be perfectly acceptable to take a smaller financial value for the ease of the transaction of just disposing of the material all at once. But provide that list of dealers and auction houses. The other thing that, you know, I found is, when I have a question about material, seeking out the specialized society for that type of material, always I find my way to a resource that can help me understand what it is I'm looking at and what to do with it. If you've got particular friends that you know in the hobby that might be willing to help, or have agreed to help prepare your material for sale, make sure you've documented that with their contact information, so that your heirs can, you know, contact them and help engage their services. And by having it documented, you don't have any risk that someone fraudulently, and I realize this is probably a very rare occurrence in our world, but that there's any risk of fraud, of someone coming out and saying, oh, you know, Bob promised me this, or Bob said I could help do this, when in fact that may not be the case. And there, you know, there's some sort of downside risk there. So written instructions that can be easily shared. All right. The selection of an administrator. So most of us, when we've set up our estate plans, have designated someone in our family to be the executor of the estate. And that's all well and good, but if you're like me, no one in my family knows anything about stamps or cares to know anything about stamps. So finding somebody who does, and designating that they be the co-executor for the philatelic portions of my estate is probably a really good idea. And again, back to the, you know, I keep beating the drum about precise instructions around the specific items. And yeah, it's as I said, perfectly comfortable. Leverage, if you're an APS member, they do have estate advisory service. You know, they don't make a big deal about it, because I think they don't want to be flooded. But their website has many of the same instructions I've talked about today are available on the APS website. You can call them and get advisory support from them if you'd like. Your heirs can contact them and get, if you're an APS member, your heirs can contact them and get the same advice. And then they also offer, kind of hidden down in the small text of their website, they will provide you with these estate advisory labels. And basically what you do is you stick them on to the binder or the album or whatever, and it allows you to kind of fill in the blanks about what's in there in that particular binder, album, or box, so that it's easier for your heirs to understand how to match your inventory list to the physical material and understand what the physical material and get some. So if you want them, all you got to do is call and ask as a member, and they will they'll send them to you. I think, yeah, that's the pretty much kind of the straightforward approach to how you should organize yourselves and some of the actions I think you should probably take. And that's the website for the APS for their estate advice. And if you were to click through to that link and look at it, you'll go, John, I understand where you got most of the material for your presentation. But any questions or comments that I can address for anybody?